Before I start, really, I'll put Dave Cushman's website up there. I'm sure you all know Dave Cushman's website, probably the world's most comprehensive beekeeping website. I will be referring to it several times during the lecture, and there's the URL up there. Right, so a bit about my beekeeping so you can see where I've been coming from. I've been keeping bees since 1963. And the smarter of you in the audience will work out that I was actually in the embryonic stage when I started. At one stage, for about 15 years, I had about 130 colonies and used beekeeping for part of my living. Now I'm down to more sensible levels, around about 20 to 25 of my own. I'm also apiary manager of my local beekeeping association, Whisper Green Beekeepers Association, where we vary between perhaps 30 and 50 colonies. We got up to 48 this summer. We're down now to about 35, something like that. I then go out and see quite a lot of members, have a look at the bees, perhaps problems, that sort of thing. And as most of you know, I get around the country quite a bit, do visits, demonstrations and that sort of thing elsewhere. I was born and brought up on a farm in West Sussex, and I've been an engineer all my working life, so I'm a practical person, I'm a practical beekeeper. I'm not a scientific beekeeper, although occasionally if they've got something that I think might be useful to me, I tend to use it. So a lot of my beekeeping is based on observation, seeing the bees, listening to what they're telling me, and a bit of logic as well. And that's logic, not false logic. So I've actually seen and handled a lot of colonies, probably more than the vast majority of beekeepers will come across, apart from obviously commercial beekeepers and bee inspectors. I've been raising queens for over 50 years, probably something like 52, 53 years, something like that. And up until about 20 years ago, I had a pretty high success rate. You could put a queen cell in a colony and walk away and leave it, come back in 4 weeks' time, and you'll have a queen laying away. But now things are very, very much different. The success rate is very much lower, and queens are affected by the problems I'm going to speak to you about. It doesn't matter how they're raised, whether they're natural queen cells or grafted or cell punch or cell plug, millet, anything. It really doesn't matter. But I'm actually doing very, very little different than I've ever done. Hands up, please. Who's been keeping bees over 20 years? Okay, I hope some of you folk will agree with some of the things that I'm going to say. Those of you who come into beekeeping since, what you're seeing now, you may just think is normal. So, what's the history from my point of view? I first noticed these problems around about the turn of the 21st century, something like that. And initially I spoke to other beekeepers and, oh, no, we haven't had a problem, I now know perhaps why they didn't see a problem. So what are they then? There are several, and they're actually quite varied. I'm really going to concentrate on 3 of them, but I think there are other issues involved. Everything I tell you will occur naturally. I haven't got a problem with that. The problem is the rate of occurrence. There may be several causes. I thought quite a bit about causes, and I'm usually offered some advice. It's very often down the same sort of track, but I am actually keeping quite an open mind about it. What I really want to get the message across is that the causes may not be natural. There is very little in books. There's one excellent book that I expect you all know about that's got reference to it, but there's virtually nothing in books. You won't find it. But we are getting more references in magazines, online, and that sort of thing from quite a wide variety of beekeepers. So let's look just a little bit closer then. What should happen naturally with queens? What I mean by naturally is up there in the tree without any intervention from man at all. perhaps they'll live between 3 and 5 years before being superseded. I've had many queens in the past that have gone on 6 years, but you know, 3 is probably a bit short. But perhaps if you've got queens that are very prolific, perhaps they wear themselves out early, so perhaps Italians, those sort of things, those sort of queens might only live 3 years, but certainly 4, 5, 6 years used to be normal. Perhaps in that lifetime, some of them may not have swarmed at all. Others perhaps up to 3 times, quite commonly. If you've got perhaps carniolans, it's a hell of a job to keep in a hive sometimes. Supersedure naturally occurs at the end of the season, and in my part of the world, West Sussex, it used to be any time from the sort of second week of July, so sort of middle of July, right through normally to the back end of August, occasionally to the back end of September. So that's natural supersedure when the bees did it themselves. Any failures tended to be in the spring when perhaps a queen would come through the winter as a drone layer, or sometimes occasionally not even laying at all. So what's happening now then? Well, queen cells not resulting in laying queens for several reasons. Young queens being superseded, probably in their first, sometimes in their second year. Young queens failing and queens simply disappearing. There are other issues that are possibly be related. I'm going to mention a few of them because I think there is an element of commonality about them. Let's look first at queen cells not resulting in laying queens. There's one of my queens. Looks absolutely fine apart from the wings. Look at that. It's surprising, folks, how often you get queens emerge with wings like that. It's surprising. It could be anything. Could be a sort of stumpy wing like that, or it could be a crumpled wing, or it could be no wing at all, you know, right back to the joint. Very often you get one wing over the back of the bee and the other one out at an angle, perhaps up to 90 degrees, something like that. There's absolutely no way that can fly, or if it does, it's going to fly around in circles and come back home again. There's another one there. That one there has got a perfect wing one side and no wing the other side. And for that reason, I now suggest that beekeepers check in colonies around about the time that a virgin queen should emerge, so that you can see the virgin queen and make sure she's okay. If she's not okay, then obviously take her out and replace her in some way. I know the books will tell you not to do it, but I'm suggesting very, very strongly that you do. Don't do it during the day, perhaps between 10 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night, because if they are okay, they might well be out on a mating or orientation flight. This is a photograph that was taken at the Wisp Green Teaching Open, 14th of July 2016. There's a little knot of bees there, and what you get is a little knot of bees around about the size of a golf ball, something like that. In the middle of it was this queen, and one wing is where it should be, and the other one is sticking out at an angle. That queen clearly couldn't fly, and she just went down on the ground. Other bees came in, formed a little cluster, and that was it. Now, the issue is with this, if you leave it as you're told to do, you think there's something happened with the queen out there. She hasn't even got off the ground. These are 3 queen cells of a batch of 10, done by the punch cell method. So they may not be related, because it looks to me as if there's a possibility of a virus problem there. But it's a problem that we never used to have. If you notice, they've died in different states as well. But if you think about it, there's a 30% loss before you start. The reasons usually given for queens not getting mated is the birds, of course, get the blame, don't they? Birds taking them. Whether there's any evidence or not, poor old birds get the blame. Bad weather. Most years you can get away with that. You certainly couldn't get away with it this year. And I can tell you we still had exactly the same problems this year, same sort of level as previously. So I think we can knock that one on the head, or simply they just got lost, they couldn't find their way back home or whatever. This is what the sort of skeptics will tell you. Now let's just look at the early supersedure. Get queen cells built with young queens. Young queens, probably in the first year or two. On many occasions I've seen supersedure cells put up before the first brood is even sealed. There's often no visible problem with the brood. You look at it, it looks okay, the right sort of amount, looks healthy enough, no obvious problem with the queen. And then all of a sudden, you get between 1 and 3 queen cells built, often on the edge of brood, and very often too on food frames. On many occasions I've seen supersedure cells on frames, or combs rather, without other brood on, even on food frames. Now with what I call natural supersedure, very often in the spring, which usually happens in the autumn by the way, usually in the spring you see 2 queens, obviously mother and daughter. Now with this, what I call modern supersedure, that very, very rarely happens. It does occasionally, and about 4 or 5 years ago, I ended up in July with 3 queens in the same hive. So there's something odd going on. Yeah, often 2 supersedures in the same summer in the same colony too. It's the sort of thing that beekeepers don't always recognise. Now, one of the problems is, of course, that despite what you might hear from various places, bees will swarm if they're in the right condition, the weather's right, you know, they're not nice and strong. If you've got a queen cell in there, even if it's an emergency cell or a supersedure cell, there's a pretty high chance that they will actually swarm on those. Now, of course, the problem is that you go through a colony, you inspect it, go through 3 or 4 frames, see no queen cells. What do? You close it up and go on to the next one. 2 days later, out comes a swarm, and you think, well, it can't be that colony because I went through it 2 days ago. Go through it again, and very often you'll see a small number of queen cells. Don't forget with supersedure cells, there's usually less than 3. They're usually close together, and they're usually the same, or roughly the same age, within a few hours anyway. Now I know that queens that are mated in mini nukes will often be quickly superseded. We know that, that's not what I mean. And I don't mean young queens either, or queens that have come in from some distance away, probably not been laying for some time, going in a colony where a laying queen has been taken out, and very often in those circumstances, yes, the bees will put up supersedure cells. I don't mean that. Most of what I'm telling you about, the queen has actually been mated in the colony where she emerged from. There's a comb there where you can see that the queen has recently laid. Pattern looks pretty good to me, but supersedure cell. Now, a lot of beekeepers wouldn't notice that. Whisper Green Teaching Apiary, 17th of July 2016. There's a supersedure cell there that's emerged. No other brood on the comb at all. So, you know, you've got to look on everything. Even people like me have swarms. This colony swarmed in 2009, and I'd actually inspected it. There was just 1 queen cell left, and the colony obviously swarmed on that. So there was only 1 queen cell, but that was a young queen that was so young I hadn't even clipped and marked her yet. So they'd gone off with her and left this one behind. So if anyone tells you that bees won't swarm on supersedure cells, point them in my direction. This inspection on the 16th of September 2016, and there are 2 queens there. And for those of you who can't spot queens, there's one and there's the other one. You all okay? Whichever one of those was the mother, she was first noted on the record sheet as laying on the 18th of June. This is only, what, 3 months later, and there she is, superseded already. On the face of it, it doesn't look like being very much wrong with either of them, but bees obviously thought there was. Now, the vast majority of beekeepers probably wouldn't even notice that. Bearing in mind it's the 16th of September, there aren't too many people actually looking their colonies at that time. But that's the sort of thing that's happening. And these are some of the reasons, I think, why these issues aren't noticed. Now queens failing often appear to be laying absolutely fine, no problem at all. Then all of a sudden you tend to get drone, or one of the issues is you get drones in worker cells. Now you can tell if they're in worker cells easily because they're generally single, whereas drones, in drone cells, you tend to get them in little clusters. You very, very rarely get single drone cells. And also, in the summer, perhaps when the queen should be laying away fine, you go to one inspection and she's laying right across the box, go to the next one 7, 10, 14 days later, and very often what you find is she's laying in the middle 2 or 3 frames, and the eggs she's laying are all over the place, all over the place. I've never known a queen get over a problem like that, but you know, they go from laying really well to a problem in a very, very short space of time. And then of course you tend to get an irregular brood pattern. Now I'll mention irregular brood pattern here because I think it's quite important. We're very often told that you should have these lovely patches of brood. That's fine, but have a look, observation again, have a look at the comb. If the cells are filled up with whatever, could be pollen, could be nectar, which you very often get in a nectar flow, the queen can't lay in it, so she's got to lay in the available cells, which could be all over the place. That then will have a knock-on effect throughout the rest of the summer. So you really ought to read the comb, as Clarence was talking about yesterday. So I've shown that slide on many occasions, and I've had lots of people say, what's wrong with that? That doesn't look too bad. Yeah, there might be a few holes in there. Have a look at it closer. That little area there, which is probably a quarter of a comb, there's 10 drone cells. There's very definitely a problem with that queen. In my experience, she won't get any better. I could probably say that queen will either be superseded or she'll disappear within about 6 weeks. So now queens disappearing. Again, they often appear to be laying perfectly in our eyes. Doesn't seem to be too much problem with the brood. And then they usually, not always, but usually, probably 80–90% of the time, they stop laying instantly. So you can't see a ramp down in the egg laying. This might be significant because in my experience, in about 50% of the cases, they put up emergency cells, and 50% of the cases they don't. That tends to suggest to me that the queen has gone off lay for whatever reason, and this could be in the height of the summer, gone off lay for whatever reason, stayed in the colony for several days to the point where the bees have got nothing that they can produce emergency cells, and then died, disappeared, or whatever. The timing is rarely right for a queen to be lost or killed during a manipulation, and I've got another example here. I've been out to the Hudson Valley area of the United States in 2016, 2017. I was invited to give some bee improvement and queen rearing courses. And we inspected colonies, and this one, the frame was taken out, and straight away I saw emergency cells. So we looked at them a little bit closer, looked at the records. That colony had last been inspected 14 days previously. The youngest brood was around about 9 to 10 days old. It was sealed, but only just. Okay, and there are the queen cells, very definitely emergency. that queen had disappeared. It's looking about 4 days perhaps after the previous inspection. So it couldn't have been that the queen was killed. I'm giving some examples. They're actually going to be dotted around age-wise, simply because I've got photographs generally to back it up, and also to let you folk know that these things have been happening some time, long time. On the 4th of March this year, at the Whisper Green Beekeeping Association apiary, and there may well be people who can back me up, there were emergency cells seen in a colony. The following week at my own apiary, the same thing again. Now what happened with the first one was, we had a meeting just to check the food and that sort of thing, and being a teacher in apiary, I'm quite happy to take the crown board off and just quickly show people what's happening, what the bees are doing. Anyway, there's something wasn't quite right with the colony, and as an experienced beekeeper, I spotted it. So we had a look through, and all of a sudden, there was an emergency cell looking at me. So that's how we spotted that. But on the 4th of March, most people don't go looking into their brood chambers. But these things are happening, and most beekeepers aren't spotting them. Both laying queens are gone. There's the one at the Whisper Green teaching apiary. You can see the brood there, all sealed, no unsealed brood at all. And there are 2 of the, I think there was something like 6 emergency cells on the 4th of March. Now, we hadn't touched that colony since last year, so, you know, we couldn't have done anything to it. What's interesting is whatever emerged from that, she went out and got mated, and she started laying. So the maths don't line up, but she did. Right, this year again, 2018 in Whisper Green apiary, we had queens disappear in 3 strong honey-producing colonies. Bear in mind, we've only got about less than 30 honey-producing colonies. There's 10% of them. Now, there may well have been later ones, and queens have disappeared in these. There they are. Tree creeper, yaffle and firecrest are because we give our colonies names of birds. But one on the 17th of May, one on the 9th of June, and one on the 23rd of June. All of them were the previous year's queens, and they were all laying well. If you folk come across any of these, don't start beating yourself up and thinking that you've done something wrong. You probably haven't, because other people are or should be experiencing exactly the same thing. So don't think that you're killing queens. You're probably not. I've been keeping bees 50 years, and I can honestly say the number of queens I've seen killed, I can well count on 2 hands. It's 7. So the killing of queens is very, very rare unless you're a very, very clumsy beekeeper. I know these issues are universal. I'm sure Clarence will come up with similar stories. I'm speaking to beekeepers in other countries, and I've witnessed it myself in the United States. What I'm told, I don't use imported queens, and I certainly haven't bought any queens for 50 years. But what I'm told is that very often they get superseded, or they just disappear, or they become drone layers. So it seems to me there's a problem elsewhere as well. Now, if you as a beekeeper take no action, it could be terminal. Could be terminal. So I suggest very strongly that you inspect your colonies on a fairly regular basis. When I say terminal, yes, I do mean dead. And that's the death of a colony isn't just a winter problem these days. It can be a summer problem as well. Personally, I think it's quite a big cause of winter losses. Last winter, a very high percentage of our losses, well, say our, mine and the Beekeeping Association, what, 50, 60 colonies, were caused through queen problems in one way and another. But you beekeepers need to be alert. You need to be up to speed about what should be happening, so you can recognise if there is an issue. A few thoughts on this. My queens aren't living anywhere near as long as they did. Those folk with 20 years experience, I suspect, but I don't know, I suspect theirs aren't living anywhere near as long either. I think if they're good queens and had good, productive, healthy colonies with the right characteristics you want, I think they're okay to breed from. I don't think there's a problem doing that. Now, we might have an opportunity here because the colonies are often strong, very common that they're strong, so we may be able to use that in some way. Perhaps any queen cells that are put up, don't forget if the queen's gone, she's disappeared, that's all you've got. You might as well use the supersedure cells or whatever. You also have a queenless or can have a queenless colony, so you can raise queens in there from anything else you want to. So it's not all negative. I've got details on Dave Cushman's website. Just punch in queen problems and you'll get my experiences. Some of these plus several more. So what else then? It's surprising the number of times you'll see emergency queen cells in colonies where the queen is laying well. I mean emergency cells, I don't mean supersedure, I don't mean a swarm. It's surprising. Have a look. Test comb, and I'm sure you all know what a test comb is, it used to be absolutely 100% accurate. These days, very often you know jolly well that a colony is queenless. Put a test comb in and the bees just do not react at all. What's going on? I don't know. I think it might be connected in some way, but I'm not too sure. On many occasions, I've had emergency cells still unsealed 11 to 12 days after the queen has been removed. Work it out, it shouldn't happen, but it does on many occasions. So if perhaps you think you go through a colony, you might dequeen it or whatever, go through 7 or 8 days later, raw out all the emergency cells. Very often they seem to be able to hold some back, and they can produce more. Check it. Don't believe me, just go. This is observation. Look through your colonies and I think you'll find a lot more than you expect to see. When you're raising queens artificially, by grafting or cell punch or something like that, if you've got a bar of 8 or 10, you can spot if things appear to be wrong. And I don't know why it is, but in the last few years, some queens are now emerging late. Anything up to 4 days is quite common. And you think, oh, they're no good, rip them out, and there's a live queen inside. So that never used to happen in my recollection. Right, here's an example of Whisper Green apiary. We had a queen removed on Saturday 11th of June 2016. We still had emergency cells emerging on Saturday the 2nd of July, 21 days from the laying of the egg. It shouldn't happen, but there it was. Now, what is going on? I don't know, haven't got a clue. I hope some of the scientists at some stage will have a look at this. So there's more. In the old days, you folks have been keeping bees 20 years, you could take a swarm, you could chuck it into a hive, and you could walk away and leave it for the rest of the year. If it was early in the year, put a super on it, chances are you get a super honey. Later in the year, just let it build up, and that's it. You can't do that now, because swarm queens, very often they quickly disappear or fail or are superseded. Don't know why, but that's it. If you get a natural swarm, the bigger it is, usually it's got a fertile queen in it. The smaller it is, it's got a virgin queen. Prime swarm and a cast. Unless, of course, intervention from the beekeeper where perhaps they've clipped a queen. Queens come out with a swarm, swarm's gone back home, so the swarms come out with the first virgin queen to emerge. That's really the only way we used to get virgin queens in large swarms. These days, it's surprising how many tiny swarms you get with fertile queens. They could be coming from collapsed colonies, but I suspect more than likely they're coming from colonies with one of the problems. Perhaps they're putting up supersedure cells and swarming on them swarming with the old queen and leaving the supersedure cell behind. And a lot of large swarms with virgin queens these days too. And I think again probably what's happened is the queen may well be clipped. She's come out and you've had exactly the same situation that I had, swarm on the first queen to emerge. Queen introduction in my experience is nowhere near as successful as it used to be. It used to be you could put a queen in a cardboard matchbox with 3, 4, half dozen workers, put her in a colony, close it down, go back 14 days later, 10, 14 days later, and she'd just be laying away, no trouble at all. Now, very often they're not even accepting them. You find them dead in the cage. So there's something going on there as well. Here's some examples. I think it was 2006, I can't remember. I was asked to, well, I'd done quite a bit of writing about the problems, and I was asked by a apiary manager of a local beekeeping association, teaching apiary, said, I think I've got one of the problems that you mentioned, come and have a look. So I did, I went and had a look. They had about 20 colonies, lovely teaching apiary, and I actually found 4 problems, and this was one of them. And somebody taken a swarm, put it in a box, and left it. And I think we checked it 5 to 6 weeks after hiving, and that's what we found. Up go the queen cells. Although they're not supersedure cells, there's too many, I think they were emergency cells. So that's the sort of thing we found, and that's probably 50 miles from me. I'm getting to the point now where I can predict a problem, and this was exactly the same teaching apiary. So it was 2006, they had a problem. And I had an email a few weeks later, and this was it. The hive number 1 that had patchy brood and you said would probably go queenless did exactly that about 3 weeks after you left. It took 3 attempts to requeen it and is still relatively weak going into the winter. So there's somebody from outside, and I hadn't seen that colony before or since, and I could predict what was going to happen. 25th of June 2014 was the Green Beekeeping Association meeting again. We inspected 28 colonies. We had a problem with 10 of them. We couldn't inspect all the colonies and something had to be done to one of them, so I went back the following day and there was a problem with that. So 40% at any one time, all this stuff is recorded, or should be. 2 of those had emergency cells and laying queens. 1st of July 2016, home apiary with 13 colonies. I was dealing with problems in 6 colonies, 6 out of 13. 45% of a problem. And here they are. 1 dud queen cell, might have been black queen cell virus or something like that, and it may not have been related to the rest. 1 failing queen, that was a previous year's queen. 1 had disappeared, previous year's queen. 3 supersedures, 1 of which was a previous year's queen. 2 were current year's queens. 1st of July. That's my own apiary at home. Going back to the States again. June 2016. I visited 5 apiaries with approximately 100 colonies total. In every apiary, we found problems. I had to show them what it was, and they didn't know, didn't even guess. But I think it was probably because most of them have been keeping bees started keeping bees in the last 15 years or so. So what has happened then? I first noticed it around about 2000. In reality, it was probably a year or two before that, when I perhaps wasn't expecting the amount of problems that we since had. I've been highlighting it as best as I can. I've given this lecture on many occasions, and some of you folk have probably heard it before. I've put information on Dave Cushion's website, magazine articles. I think the first one in BBK News, I believe, was 2004. Unfortunately, there's a denial by some so-called experts, and I'll put experts in inverted commas because there are some people who seem to think they've got a little more knowledge than they actually have. Why they're denying there's a problem, I don't know. It may just be that perhaps they don't look at their own bees as much as they should do. I've been accused on several occasions of being a poor beekeeper. God, you must be killing your queens. Well, some of you folk have seen me handle colonies of bees. I'm happy to handle a colony of bees in front of anybody else. And if you think I'm a poor handler and a poor beekeeper, then please tell me. But I'm not all of a sudden going to be changing after 50 years of keeping bees. We know there problems are experienced by others worldwide, and there is now more being reported because there's quite a lot of stuff actually coming through magazines and that sort of thing. SICM is an organisation of European beekeepers who are, let's say, enthusiasts of either native bees or near native bees. They have a conference every 2 years, and in 2012 that conference was in Landquart in Switzerland. I gave a very much shorter version of this talk. I think I only had about 20 minutes allocated. And afterwards, there was a whole queue waiting, about a dozen people waiting to speak to me. In amongst them was a French lady, and she said, "I'm really pleased I've listened to your talk," she said, "because I've been experiencing exactly the same problems that you have, but all my scientific colleagues telling me I must be doing something wrong." Right, is there a problem? Well, you make your own mind up. I'm telling you yes. A lot of other people are saying yes as well, and I've been noting a few nodding heads and people talking to each other. I think you have had them as well. Unfortunately, a few people say no. So what do I think then? There are actually many problems, a few more than I'll put up here on the screen. I think probably there are quite a lot of reasons as well, and even the same issue may not always have the same cause. Mathematically, bees can't survive long, because if they're losing so many queens, then because of their low reproductive levels, I think they would just go extinct sooner or later, if it was in the wild and things were happening in the wild, I mean. We know there are problems in other countries, I've told you about that. Personally, I'm telling you there is a problem. But we must keep an open mind about causes and not just blame the few obvious ones. So what does this mean for the beekeeper then? Well, queens certainly aren't living as long. We as beekeepers need to be much more alert when we're looking for looking through our colonies. If you're raising queens, raise more than you actually need, because you will have you will have losses. Sadly, you can lose good breeding material, as I have on several occasions. I can tell you that's pretty annoying, and it can be instant, because of course if you lose a queen and then you don't go to the colony for perhaps 14 days, there's nothing there that you can raise queens from. A dequeen colony can still produce emergency cells after more than 8 days. You've got to bear that one in mind. So look right through your colony, shake the bees off the frames. Queens can emerge late. Perhaps if you are raising your own queens, perhaps a bar of 10, you might have one that will emerge later than the rest. I'm suggesting to you folk that if you've got good queens, keep them as long as you possibly can. Don't just replace queens, as we're told, willy-nilly, because you've got a very, very valuable resource. Why knock it on the head? So what could beekeepers be doing? Firstly, recognise there are problems. And you folk that have been stuck at keeping bees for the last 20 years, unless you've actually picked some of these up, you may not notice it. Understand what should be happening. Go back, look at some of the older books, the good standards that just keep going, and understand what should happen in a colony. Please, 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 simply don't just dismiss the problems as weather or birds or anything of that nature. Please alert others to the problems, especially if you're a beekeeping teacher. Let them know that these issues exist so they know how to handle it when they do get a problem, because they're not going to find the answers in books. Recognise good healthy brood, so that if all of a sudden you've got some drones in amongst the worker brood, you realise that you've got a problem on its way. And of course report and discuss problems within your own association. As far as management is concerned, is keep basic records. I'm suggesting that you inspect colonies regularly. Every 14 days will be okay, there's no problem with that. But please, please, please don't leave it 2 or 3 months, something like that, because you can end up with a colony that's on its last legs. And check every comb in the brood box, because as I've already mentioned, very often you'll find supersedure cells on combs of food. Shake bees off frames unless you need the queen cells, but if you're looking for queen cells, just shake them off, light shake, so you see things. Check for eggs at every inspection. Just because there's brood there and they appear queen right, doesn't necessarily mean that the queen is laying. And I'm suggesting very, very strongly that you clip and mark queens. Clip them in case they swarm on supersedure cells, and marking, because I think you'll find it surprising how often the queen you see at this inspection isn't the one you saw at the last inspection. You'd be surprised. Check it, mark it. Check for a small cluster of bees, all within 20 feet, I should think, of a hive, if you can, when you expect queens to be mated. A little cluster about the size of a golf ball, with anything up to about 20 bees in. All the rest of the bees, of course, would have gone home, but left the queen there, or most of them would. How about getting queens to emerge into cages, you know, these hair curler cages? If you do, you can check to see that she's got all her wings, and you haven't then got to look into a colony for a virgin queen, which aren't that easy to find. I encourage people to do it, and certainly at Whisper Green I do, because I think it's important to know the difference, in the behavioural difference between fertile queens and virgin queens. Check virgin queens for after emergence, certainly within the first 2 or 3 days, something like that. You go much longer than that and you must expect them to be possibly out flying. So make sure they've got their wings. Have extra colonies with spare queens. I've got another talk which shows you how to have an extra colony that I call a support colony with another group of colonies, perhaps 4 to 6, something like that. It's surprising how often you need to find another queen. And raise at least double the number of queens that you want. So if you want to, raise at least 4 or perhaps even 6. So the future then. Personally, I think it could be long term. It's taken 20 years now. Finally, I'm getting a few people to realise that actually there are problems. Personally, I think there are many causes. I don't think it would just be down to one thing. So I think from the scientist's point of view, and I need a scientist to tell me, I think it will need several disciplines that will to be investigated. So there's much research to do, I think. It might be why everybody's fighting a bit shy of it. So the conclusion then, it's not all doom and gloom, promise you. Please, please, please continue to rear your own queens. They're probably going to be far better than some that you import. They might at least suit the locality for a start. I have seen some brilliant queens, really good queens, as well as the poor ones, and we must be positive.